Staff Sergeant Maria Santos pressed her eye against the scope of her rifle, watching the storm clouds gather across the valley like an army preparing for battle. The wind had already started picking up, sending loose rocks skittering down the mountainside where her sniper team had taken position. Through her earpiece, she could hear the doubt in her spotter's voice. "Sergeant, this weather's getting worse by the minute," Corporal Jake Mitchell said, his binoculars trained on the same target compound 3 kilometers away. "Command says the storm front will hit us in 20 minutes. Maybe we should call this off." Maria adjusted her position slightly, feeling the first drops of rain hit her face. The mission briefing had been clear. Intelligence suggested that General Hassan Malik, the leader of a terrorist cell responsible for attacks on 3 Allied bases, would be meeting with his lieutenants in the compound below. This was their one chance to eliminate him before he disappeared into the network of caves that honeycombed these mountains. "Negative on calling it off," Maria replied, her voice steady despite the growing wind. "We've been tracking this target for 6 months. This is our shot." The radio crackled to life. It was Major Reynolds from the command post, his voice tight with concern. "Overwatch 1. We're reading sustained winds of 40 knots in your area, gusting to 60. Precipitation increasing rapidly. What's your assessment?" Maria had made shots in difficult conditions before, but she'd never attempted a precision shot at this distance in weather like this. The rain was starting to fall harder now, and she could feel the crosswind pushing against her position. Through her scope, she watched the flags around the compound whipping violently in the wind. "Copy. Control. Conditions are challenging but manageable," she responded. Though privately, she wondered if she was being overconfident. The target window was only going to be open for another 30 minutes, according to intelligence. After that, Malik would be gone. Jake looked at her with concern. "Maria, I've seen you make impossible shots, but this storm is going to be a monster. The wind speed alone makes the ballistics calculations nearly impossible, and once that rain really starts coming down, visibility will drop to almost nothing." She understood his worry. Jake had been her spotter for 2 years, and they'd worked together on dozens of missions. He knew her capabilities better than anyone, but he also knew the limits of what was humanly possible. A shot at 3 kilometers in perfect conditions was challenging enough for even the best snipers. Adding hurricane-force winds and driving rain made it seem impossible. "I know the risks," Maria said, making minute adjustments to her rifle's position. "But look at what's at stake here. Malik has the blood of over 200 soldiers and civilians on his hands. Intelligence says he's planning something big for next month. If we let him slip away now, we might not get another chance." The compound below was a cluster of low buildings surrounded by high walls. Through her scope, Maria could see movement in the courtyard. Several figures in traditional robes were gathering near the main building. According to their intelligence, Malik would emerge from the central structure to meet with his commanders at exactly 14:30 hours local time. That gave her less than 15 minutes. "Contact, southeast corner of the compound," Jake called out, his voice suddenly alert. "I've got eyes on 3 individuals matching the description." "Wait." 4th person emerging from the main building. Maria shifted her scope to the area Jake had indicated. Through the increasingly heavy rain, she could make out the figures. One of them was taller than the others, wearing a distinctive white head wrap that matched the description in their target package. "That's him," she whispered. "Hassan Malik. White head wrap. Standing near the fountain in the center of the courtyard." The wind was howling now, and Maria could feel it buffeting against her rifle. She'd trained for shots in high wind conditions, but nothing quite like this. The key was to time the shot for a brief lull in the wind speed, but with gusts this strong and this chaotic, finding that perfect moment would be like trying to thread a needle in an earthquake. "Overwatch 1, control. Weather Service is reporting the storm intensifying ahead of schedule. You now have winds gusting to 70 knots. Recommend abort and extract to secondary position." Major Reynolds' voice came through the radio with unmistakable urgency. Maria watched through her scope as Malik gestured to his men, apparently giving instructions. Intelligence had suggested this meeting was to finalize plans for a major attack on a civilian target. Every minute he remained free was another minute closer to that attack becoming reality. Control, Overwatch 1. Target is in position and vulnerable, requesting permission to engage despite weather conditions. There was a long pause before the Major responded. Overwatch 1. The shot probability in these conditions is assessed as less than 20%. The risk of collateral damage due to wind drift is significant. Are you certain you can make this shot? Maria felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Around her, the storm was building to a crescendo. The rain was now coming down in sheets, and the wind was so strong that her spotter was having to brace himself against a rock to keep his binoculars steady. Any reasonable assessment would say the shot was impossible, but Maria Santos had never been one to accept the word impossible. She'd grown up in the mountains of Colorado, where her father had taught her to shoot in all kinds of weather. She'd learned to read wind patterns, to feel the rhythm of the storm, to find those brief moments of calm that existed even in the heart of chaos. "Jake, give me wind readings every 10 seconds, she instructed her spotter. "I need to find the pattern." "Wind from the southeast, gusting between 55 and 70 knots, Jake called out, his voice barely audible over the storm. "This is insane, Maria. Even if you could compensate for the wind, the rain is going to affect the bullet's trajectory." Maria knew he was right about the rain. Water droplets could deflect a bullet, especially over a distance this great. But she also knew something that the textbooks didn't teach. She'd been studying this specific valley for 3 days, learning its weather patterns, understanding how the mountains channeled the wind. Storms here didn't move randomly. They followed predictable patterns, and she thought she was beginning to see one. Through her scope, she watched Malik continue his conversation with his lieutenants. He was standing in exactly the position intelligence had predicted, completely unaware that he was being watched from 3 kilometers away. This was the moment they'd been waiting for, the culmination of months of planning and preparation. Control, Overwatch 1. I'm taking the shot. Overwatch 1, negative, stand down, the risk is too great. But Maria had already stopped listening to the radio. She was deep in the zone now, that place where the world narrowed down to just the rifle, the target, and the space between them. She could feel the rhythm of the wind, the way it gusted and died. Gusted and died. There was a pattern there, a brief moment every 30 seconds or so when the wind dropped to manageable levels. "Maria, don't do this," Jake pleaded. "If you miss, or if you hit one of the other men, this whole operation is blown. We'll lose any chance of tracking Malik's network." She understood his concern, but she also understood something else. Sometimes in life, in war, in moments that mattered, you had to trust in your training, your instincts, and your ability to do the impossible. Everyone said the shot couldn't be made in these conditions. But Maria Santos had spent her entire military career proving that what everyone said was impossible was simply another challenge to overcome. The wind began to die down slightly, and Maria felt the familiar calm that always came over her in the moments before a critical shot. Her breathing slowed, her heart rate dropped, and the world around her seemed to crystallize into perfect focus. Through her scope, she could see Malik clearly, still standing in the same position, still completely unaware of the danger he was in. This was her moment. This was what she'd trained for her entire life. The storm raged around her. Everyone told her the shot was impossible. But Maria Santos was about to prove them all wrong. Maria felt the world slow around her as she entered what snipers called the zone. Her finger moved to the trigger, but she didn't apply pressure yet. She needed to wait for the perfect moment. That brief window when all the variables aligned. Through her scope, she could see Malik gesturing animatedly to his men, completely unaware that his life hung in the balance. "Wind southeast, 62 knots, gusting to 70, Jake called out, rain streaming down his face as he fought to keep his binoculars steady. "Maria, this is suicide. The bullet drift alone will be over 6 feet at this range." But Maria had calculated for that. She'd been watching the wind patterns for the past 10 minutes, and she'd noticed something that gave her hope. Every 30 to 40 seconds, there was a brief lull in the wind speed, a moment when the gusts dropped to around 30 knots. It wasn't perfect conditions by any means, but it was workable if she timed it exactly right. She adjusted her aim point, compensating not just for the current wind speed but for what she predicted the wind would be doing when the bullet reached its target 3 seconds from now. It was an incredibly complex calculation that she was doing mostly by instinct, based on years of experience and hundreds of hours of training in difficult conditions. Overwatch 1. This is Control. Final warning. Abort the mission and extract immediately. The storm is intensifying beyond all safe parameters. Major Reynolds' voice in her earpiece sounded genuinely frightened now. She understood his position. He was responsible for her safety and the success of the mission. From a command perspective, the smart move was to abort and try again another day. But Maria knew there might not be another day. Intelligence on Malik's movements was sketchy at best, and this was the clearest shot they'd had in 6 months of hunting him. Through her scope, she watched one of Malik's lieutenants hand him what appeared to be a folder of documents. The intelligence briefing had mentioned that Malik would be reviewing final plans for his next operation during this meeting. Every second he remained alive was another second closer to whatever horror he was planning. "Jake, I need you to trust me on this," Maria said quietly, never taking her eye from the scope. "I know it looks impossible, but I can feel the pattern in this wind. There's a window coming up in about 20 seconds. Jake had worked with Maria long enough to know better than to argue when she got that tone in her voice. He'd seen her make shots that other snipers said were impossible, shots that defied conventional wisdom and textbook calculations. But he'd never seen her attempt anything quite this challenging. "All right," he said finally. "But if you're going to do this, do it fast. I'm reading pressure changes that suggest this storm is about to get a lot worse." Maria felt her breathing automatically adjust to the rhythm she'd learned years ago in sniper school. Slow, controlled breaths that wouldn't disturb her aim. She could feel her heart rate slowing as her body prepared for the shot. This was the moment where all her training, all her experience, all her natural talent would either come together perfectly or fail spectacularly. The rain was coming down harder now, creating a constant drumming sound on the rocks around their position. Maria had to constantly wipe water from her scope lens, timing her cleaning with the wind patterns to ensure she had the clearest view possible when the moment came. "Contact movement in the compound," Jake reported. 2 additional figures emerging from the eastern building. "They're approaching Malik's position." This complicated things. More people in the target area meant a greater risk of collateral damage if the wind pushed her shot off target. But it also meant more witnesses to whatever Malik was planning, which suggested the meeting was reaching a critical phase. Maria watched through her scope as the new arrivals joined Malik's group. One of them appeared to be carrying a large map or diagram, which he spread out on a stone table in the courtyard. All the men gathered around it, with Malik pointing to various locations on what Maria assumed was a target map. "This is it," she whispered. "This is what intelligence has been waiting for. They're finalizing their attack plans right now." The wind began to shift slightly, and Maria felt the change in pressure that indicated the brief lull she'd been waiting for was approaching. This was the moment. She couldn't wait any longer without risking the complete loss of the target opportunity. She made her final adjustments, compensating for the wind drift, the rain, the distance, and the slight elevation difference between her position and the target. It was the most complex shot calculation she'd ever attempted, and she was doing most of it by feel rather than mathematical precision. "Wind, dropping," Jake called out. 50 knots. 45. Holding at 40. 45. This was as good as it was going to get. Maria knew that in another few seconds, the wind would pick up again, and her window would be gone. She applied pressure to the trigger, feeling the familiar resistance that came just before the breaking point. Through her scope, she could see Malik clearly. He was leaning over the map, pointing to something that was making his men nod in agreement. Whatever they were planning, it was happening soon, and it was going to be devastating if she didn't stop it right now. "On target," she whispered, more to herself than to Jake. Breaking the shot. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that was immediately swallowed by the howling wind. Maria felt the familiar recoil, but she forced herself to stay on target. watching through the scope to see the result of her shot. At this range, with these conditions, it would take almost 3 seconds for the bullet to reach its target. Time seemed to stretch into infinity as Maria watched the compound through her scope. She could see Malik still leaning over the map, completely unaware that a bullet was racing toward him through the storm. His men continued their conversation, pointing at various locations on their planning document. "Time of flight, 2 seconds, Jake called out, his voice tight with tension. Maria held her breath, knowing that in another second, they would know whether months of planning and preparation had paid off, or whether the storm had defeated them. Through the rain and wind, she watched Malik's position, waiting for any sign that her shot had found its mark. The bullet, traveling at over 2,000 feet per second, fought its way through the driving rain and crosswind. Maria had calculated for the wind drift, but rain was more unpredictable. Each droplet that struck the bullet could potentially alter its course by tiny amounts that would add up to significant deviation over 3 kilometers. 3 seconds, Jake announced. At exactly that moment, Maria saw Malik suddenly straighten up from the map, as if something had caught his attention. Through her scope, she could see him turning slightly to his left, which would move him just inches from where she had aimed. Those inches could be the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The shot had been fired. There was no calling it back now. Somewhere in the storm between Maria's position and the compound below, a single bullet was fighting its way through impossible conditions toward a target that might or might not still be in the right position when it arrived. Maria kept her eye pressed to the scope, watching intensely as the moment of truth approached. Everyone had said the shot was impossible in these conditions. In a few seconds, she would know whether they had been right, or whether she had just accomplished something that would be talked about in sniper schools for decades to come. The wind howled around her position, the rain continued to pour down, and 3 kilometers away, Hassan Malik remained completely unaware that his fate had already been decided by a woman with a rifle who refused to accept that anything was truly impossible. The seconds that followed the shot felt like hours to Maria, as she maintained her position behind the scope, watching the compound through the driving rain. The storm seemed to intensify the moment she fired, as if nature itself was trying to swallow up any evidence of what she had attempted. Through the increasingly poor visibility, she strained to see any movement around the target area. "Impact!" Jake suddenly called out, his voice filled with amazement. "Holy! Maria! You got him!" Direct hit. Through her scope, Maria could see the chaos that had erupted in the compound. The men who had been gathered around the map were now scattered, some taking cover, others rushing toward where Malik had been standing. But Hassan Malik himself was nowhere to be seen. In his place, there was only the stone table where he had been leaning, now stained with evidence of a successful shot. "Confirm target down," Maria said into her radio, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Hassan Malik is neutralized." "Hassan." The response from Major Reynolds came immediately, his voice a mixture of relief and disbelief. "Overwatch 1. Are you certain?" "Confirm positive identification of target elimination." Jake was scanning the compound with his binoculars, watching as Malik's men searched frantically for the source of the shot that had seemingly come from nowhere. "Positive confirmation," he reported. "Target is down and not moving. The remaining personnel are in complete chaos. They have no idea where the shot came from." Maria finally allowed herself to exhale fully, feeling the tension leave her shoulders for the first time in hours. She had done it. Despite the hurricane-force winds, despite the driving rain, despite everyone telling her it was impossible, she had made the shot. At 3 kilometers, in the middle of a raging storm, she had eliminated one of the most wanted terrorists in the region. "Outstanding work, Overwatch 1, came the voice of Colonel Harrison, the operation commander, who had apparently taken over the radio from Major Reynolds. "Initial assessment shows the target is definitely down. We're observing significant disruption in the compound's activities." As Maria watched through her scope, she could see Malik's lieutenants attempting to organize some kind of response. But without their leader, they seemed lost and confused. Some were trying to secure the documents that had been spread on the table, while others were attempting to evacuate the compound entirely. The carefully planned meeting had dissolved into chaos. "Jake, start packing up," Maria instructed her spotter. "We need to be gone before they figure out our general position and send search teams up here." But Jake was still watching the compound through his binoculars, a look of amazement on his face. "Maria, do you realize what you just did? A 3-kilometer shot in 70-knot winds and driving rain? This is going to go down in sniper history." Maria was already breaking down her rifle, working with the practiced efficiency that came from hundreds of training exercises. "It's not about making history," she said. "It's about stopping a man who was planning to kill innocent people. That's what matters." As they prepared to leave their position, Maria reflected on the shot she had just made. The ballistics calculations alone should have made it impossible. A bullet traveling 3 kilometers through air that was moving at hurricane force should have been deflected far off target. But she had read the wind patterns correctly, timed her shot for the brief lull she had predicted, and trusted in her training and instincts. "Control, this is Overwatch 1. Mission accomplished. Beginning extraction to Rally Point Alpha." "Roger, Overwatch 1. Extract immediately. Intel suggests enemy forces are mobilizing search teams. We have transport standing by at the extraction point." Maria shouldered her pack and took one last look at the compound below through her binoculars. The storm was beginning to subside slightly, and she could see more clearly now what her shot had accomplished. Malik's men were loading vehicles, apparently preparing to abandon the compound entirely. Without their leader, the entire terrorist cell was falling apart. As she and Jake began making their way down the mountainside toward the extraction point, Maria's radio crackled with an update from intelligence. "Overwatch 1. Initial intercepts suggest the elimination of Hassan Malik has caused immediate disruption to planned operations. Several cell members are attempting to surrender to local authorities." This was better than they had hoped for. Not only had they eliminated a high-value target, but the psychological impact of his death was causing the entire terrorist network to collapse. Sometimes, one precise shot at the right moment could change the course of an entire conflict. The extraction went smoothly, and within 2 hours, Maria and Jake were back at the forward operating base, being debriefed on one of the most remarkable sniper shots in military history. The ballistics experts were particularly interested in how she had compensated for the wind conditions. "Sergeant Santos," asked Major Williams from the intelligence section, "our computer models suggested that shot was mathematically impossible given the weather conditions. How did you calculate the necessary adjustments?" Maria thought about how to explain something that had been largely instinctive. "I spent 3 days studying the wind patterns in that valley," she said. "I noticed that even in severe weather, there are brief moments of relative calm. You just have to be patient enough to wait for them and skilled enough to recognize them when they come." The debriefing revealed the full scope of what her shot had accomplished. The documents that Malik and his men had been studying were recovered by friendly forces who moved into the compound after the terrorist cell abandoned it. The papers detailed plans for a coordinated attack on a school and a hospital that would have killed hundreds of civilians. "Your shot didn't just eliminate a terrorist," Colonel Harrison told her during the final briefing. "You prevented a massacre." Over the following weeks, word of Maria's shot spread throughout the military community. Sniper instructors began studying the ballistics data, trying to understand how she had succeeded where computer models said she should have failed. But for Maria, the technical aspects were less important than the results. 3 months later, Maria received word that Hassan Malik's entire terrorist organization had completely collapsed following his death. His remaining followers had either been captured or had abandoned their militant activities entirely. The network that had terrorized the region for years was gone, eliminated by a single shot fired in impossible conditions. During a ceremony where she received the Distinguished Service Cross for her actions, Maria was asked by a reporter how she had found the courage to take such a difficult shot when everyone was telling her it couldn't be done. "Sometimes the impossible is just another word for something nobody has tried hard enough to accomplish," she replied. "When innocent lives are at stake, you don't accept limitations. You find a way to overcome them." As she stood on the stage, looking out at an audience that included many of the same people who had told her the shot was impossible, Maria thought about that moment on the mountainside when she had to choose between accepting conventional wisdom and trusting in her own abilities. She had chosen to believe in herself, and that choice had made all the difference. The storm that day had been fierce and unforgiving, but Maria Santos had proved that human determination and skill could overcome even the most challenging natural obstacles. She had taken a shot that everyone said couldn't be made, in conditions that everyone said were impossible, and she had succeeded where others would have failed. Her story became legend in military circles, told and retold in training schools around the world. But for Maria, the most important part wasn't the recognition or the technical achievement. It was knowing that somewhere, children were going to school safely, and families were sleeping peacefully in their beds because she had refused to accept that anything was truly impossible when lives hung in the balance. The raging storm had tried to make the shot unattainable, but Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had proved that sometimes the impossible is just another challenge waiting to be overcome by someone brave enough to try.